Russ, why don't you take over from here and go into your thing with that as a bridge, if you
Sure.
could.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about this sort of triangular relationship between Pepper, Thad Jones, and Charles Mingus. And so I need to set up a little bit. My field of research is around Thad, as Gary's is for Pepper. So Thad, speaking of growing up in the church, Thad and his brothers were the sons of a deacon in a Baptist church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Pontiac, Michigan. So they grew up in the church, um, and no jazz on Sundays for those guys, right? So Thad is a really interesting figure because he he went to World War II. You know, he was in Guam during the war, and before he moved to New York City, there's practically, with a couple of rare, obscure exceptions, there's practically no document of his playing before he moves to New York City when he was 31 years old. I mean, it's like half of his life is over before we hear a single note from Thad. But Thad was well known to great jazz musicians in the years leading up to that, because Detroit was on the circuit where people would come through all the time. And he played in a house band of this place called the Bluebird Inn, which is a prominent jazz venue in Detroit. So before he came to New York City, he was well known to Basie and Charles Mingus, for instance. That's one of the reasons he came to New York City and quickly, hit the ground running because guys already knew him. Thad's here. So Thad came to New York City in May 1954 to join the Basie band. Frank West knew him. He had already played with Basie like once or twice in just filling in, and Frank said, "I think Thad's available if you want him." So he said, "Yeah, tell him to come on out," and move to New York City. And within a few months, 1954, by the end of the summer, Thad was already recording with Mingus. And so, immediately there's like all these recordings, one right after the other. And famously, I think there's a Dan Morgenstern interview or article about Thad that came out in Metronome magazine right away that sort of heralded um, Thad. And famously, Mingus is quoted as saying Thad is like Bartok with valves, right? Which I'm not really sure what he means by that, but it just endlessly inventive and creative, I guess, is what he's talking about there. So, uh, from 54 to 57, Thad and Mingus play a lot, or at least they record a lot. They were on each other's albums. Um, Thad's star really rises. Of course, he's on the road with Basie anytime that they leave town. So Thad is not exactly in Mingus's working ensemble, if you will, but he's always sort of in Mingus's circles. And this lasts until 1957. And this is confusing a little bit, but um, you may be aware that Mingus had his own record label in the 1950s, which was a rare thing for a jazz musician actually to run a record label. Debut Records was what it was called, and it was mostly to feature his kind of workshop group. He had sort of a an entourage of young people and composers, and that he cultivated and wanted to record with and record their music. And his wife Celia, from the song Celia, um, she was sort of the head of this record label. That was sort of her thing, and I guess she was a shrewd and kind of aggressive business person. So Thad was signed to Mingus's record label, and had an exclusive contract. And there was they wanted to record an album called the Jones Boys because there's all these guys named Jones in New York City who are great jazz musicians. And besides Hank and Elvin, there was Quincy Jones was there, Sam Jones. You can think of a whole bunch of guys. And they're like, and some guy got an idea. Hey, let's put them all together and make a record. Called it the Jones Boys. Well, um, I get a lot of this information, or I get this specific stuff from Gene Santoro's biography of Mingus, Myself When I Am Real, came out about 25 years ago or so. And he explains that okay, so Thad was on a exclusive contract with Debut Records, and uh, someone at someone associated with RCA Records. He doesn't name him by name, but I think it's Leonard Feather. Decided, hey, the Jones Boys is a good name for an album. Let's let's put Thad and these guys on it and record an album. And this sort of I it's not very clear to me how this works, but somehow there was a well, first of all, Thad was under contract, not to RCA, and he recorded this album. The album actually was released on this label called Period Records, which I had never heard of before. It was one of those little labels that get swallowed up by bigger labels. Um, but Feather was the A&R man for Period also, and recorded this album. And all of a sudden, Thad either didn't actually know that he wasn't supposed to do that, or at least he told Mingus he didn't know he wasn't supposed to do that. And um, RCA was then vulnerable to litigation because of this breach.
Mm.
Meanwhile, Mingus had recorded this album. This is 1957 summer, called Tijuana Moods. Now Thad's not on this record, but this is a really great. I hope you know this record. It's fantastic, right? And at the time that everyone's playing hard bop and playing lines and everything, this is really different. This is not Cuban. This is not like bossa nova. This is Tijuana. It's like Mexico or something. Mingus was from Nogales, and it was really you really hear Mingus like becoming himself, finding his own music, and he was really excited about this record. And this was recorded for RCA, and Celia decided to sue RCA over this Jones Boys record. And RCA, who was like, who cares? I mean, pay it out. But they decided to hold this Tijuana Moods album, and they held it for like 5 years. Didn't release it, so it was just sitting there in the can. Mingus was furious. At the moment, they said, we're not going to release it right now. And so Mingus calls up Thad on the phone. He lives in Manhattan somewhere, and he's like, is Thad there?" And Thad's wife answers the phone. She's got two little babies at home, and she's like, "Thad's not here." And Mingus subjects her to a tirade, one of his classic ones, right? And she's terrified by this. And when Thad comes home, he calls Mingus up and says, "If you ever do that again, I will kill you." Thad was not intimidated by Mingus at all. And that was the end of their relationship for pretty much um, the rest of their lives, at least working directly. And so the mind boggles at what might have been. You think about like, what if there had been a trumpet player on Mingus Aum or something like that, right? What if it had been Thad? That's what I think of. So anyway, time passes, and Thad becomes a veteran player in New York City, and at least as far as my records or my research shows, and maybe Gary, you can verify this, but the first interaction, or at least the first documentation of Pepper and Thad working together was this album they did in 1963, right after Thad had left the Basie band, called Pepper Adams Plays the Music of Charles Mingus. And shortly thereafter, obviously, Pepper and Thad hit it off, and they have a quintet together, and they record a couple albums. It's great. But I mean, you can already see, okay, it's the music of Charles Mingus. Um, Pepper and Thad did the arranging. This is like a sextet album.
And Teddy Charles.
And Teddy Charles,
Yeah.
right. It's a great record. It's a sleeper. It's not one that comes up to the top of the list, at least in my, in my looking through it. But this is a great album. And of course, Pepper by this time had a kind of a working relationship with um, with Mingus. He was the original soloist on Monin from Blues and Roots. It's like 1960. Played the killing solo on that. And so this is Pepper's album. Mingus doesn't play on the record. It's all his tunes though. And it's like Haitian Fight Song and Peggy's Blue Skylight. Beautiful songs. Mingus is there. He's at the recording session, but he's just sort of hands off, which I would love to have seen how that worked out. But apparently it worked fine. And so there's
He was
Thad.
stunned. Sorry to interrupt. Mingus was stunned because he couldn't believe how smooth the recording session was because everything, all music was prepared, everything went beautifully. Mingus could never do that. He was
Yeah,
just amazed how prepared Thad and Pepper were for the date.
yeah. The preparation was not one of Mingus's strong suits.
Oh, and just lastly, sorry to interrupt
Chaos.
again. Pepper had been working with Mingus that whole year, by the way,
Okay,
because his band with Donald Byrd had stopped. It was basically a 2 year period from like 61 through 63 when Pepper was working with Mingus quite a bit.
right. Okay. So it makes sense that he would do an entire album at this point. But the significant thing is that the Thad is right there in the middle of that, and he had actually done some arranging for that album, small group arranging, and a lot of it didn't need a whole lot of arranging. It seems like, but he's there and he's playing beautifully. He's playing incredibly on these. I would recommend Haitian Fight Song just to hear Thad in a really different setting than what you ever hear in his big band or even with his small groups. Just kind of hanging out on on a long vamp. So um, you know, Gene Santoro in his biography says, "Oh, they didn't talk for 20 years," and I was like, "Well, that's obviously not right." Um, and there is some discussion of when Jimmy Nepper played in the band with Mel Lewis and Thad at the Vanguard, that Mingus would show up at times, and Thad would get between them and say to Mingus, back off, and he would. Thad is probably the only person who really could, if not intimidate Mingus, at least see him eye to eye. Um, and then I guess the last thing about that was that, and Gary helped me out. He put me in touch with George Kanzler over the summer, and there's this album, "Let My Children Hear Music," Columbia album from like 1973, and and Kanzler had written in the CD reissue. This isn't on the original record, but on the CD reissue, he had made some commentary to the original liner notes, saying that Thad was supposed to do the arranging for that album, and they said something like, "Oh, it was writer's block, and he didn't produce anything," which I told him, I was like, I don't believe that for a second. Um, but there's all kinds of reasons why he might not have written anything, but it wasn't because he had writer's block. But I asked George, is like, where did you get that information from that he had writer's block or something? And he's like, Sue told me. And I was like, oh, okay. So just on that theme of, Mingus's strong suit is not organization. And imagine a giant orchestral album like that and how that went, uh, with without people to really kind of cultivate all of the stuff that needed to happen to get that album together.
Did Cy
So
Johnson help him with that?
yeah,
You
Cy
know?
Johnson ended up being the person to do practically everything
Yeah.
to make that happen. Um, some things didn't need much arranging; they already existed. Some of it needed complete, organization, um, and that was not. I mean, I guess Cy really his career kind of solidified around being Mingus's arranger, but that was not a particularly uh, good experience for him either, dealing with Mingus. But you know, Pepper and Thad had. I mean, they were very close. I mean, just like I was listening to you guys talk about Pepper and Elvin. Pepper and Thad obviously were very close. They've been close friends for 20 years. They had a lot of ups and downs. There were times where they really butted heads. Thad was a hard guy to get to know. Um, I mean, you could have a nice kind of collegial relationship with him. If you got closer, it got harder with Thad. And Pepper was probably his closest friend, at least in the band, besides Mel. And you know how that turned out too. So you know, Pepper's you know Pepper left the band, left Thad and Mel about a year and a half before Thad left the band, and some people have suggested to me that one of the things that kind of solidified Thad's decision to leave was that Pepper and Jerry Dodgian both left, and he's like, well, there's two best friends, so if they're not in the band, he's ready to move on. So, um, I would love to have known if Thad ever reconnected with Pepper after he left the band. Because it seemed like they were a little estranged at that time.
I don't think that they saw each other until Thad came back to lead Basie's band. There was a concert that
Really.
took place in, I think it was one of the very first concerts that Thad led of Basie's. It was a public concert at a park in Brooklyn
Hmm.
when Thad was ill, but nobody knew it. And
Mm-hmm.
I write about it in the book. And also, but at that time, Pepper was very ill. And I interviewed Gary Giddens, and he talked about what it was like when they reunited backstage. He had
Wow.
goosebumps watching it. They were hugging. It was just absolutely incredible. It seems like they hadn't seen each other since. Well, Pepper was working in Europe a lot, so
Mm-hmm.
and in Scandinavia quite a bit. So it might have been that he saw him there, but not in the States. I don't think until Thad came back
Yeah,
from his move to Denmark.
very similar to
I,
Mel. They never saw each other except in Stockholm one
Yeah,
time, and that was it.
I can add just a little bit to this. The reason a lot of these pairings and groupings of these Elvin, Thad, Hank, Tommy Flanagan were never really put together was because of the wives. I have to
yeah,
say that because I was involved in a lot of this. The wives were blocking and managing, and there was a lot of. I mean, I saw this going on with Keiko and other factions, and so even though the musicians were friendly when they met and saw that the bookings and all that stuff, it was a whole nother a dynamic going on there at that time.
Pepper's wife Claudette said that
Oh,
Keiko was.
I don't know. I'm not saying Pepper's wife because I didn't know her at all. I'm just saying that
Yeah,
the three Jones brothers and Tommy Flanagan, there was people would come down to sit in. Elvin and Mingus were all. I mean, I had dinner with Elvin and Mingus on different occasions. They were always cordial because they had worked with Bud Powell in a trio with Bud Powell and Mingus and Elvin, so they had a kind of a relationship. But there's a lot of back stuff going on that just unfortunate, just the way it was.
That
yeah.
does
I
not
was actually
surprise me
referring
at
to
all.
Keiko with Elvin. Claudette Pepper's wife said that Keiko is quote Elvin's jailer.
Well, yeah, I mean, so she blocked a lot for him. She kept him alive from the '60s until he did pass away. So, I mean, if it wasn't for her, he would not be alive. But there's a dynamic there that we don't know about, but I saw it going on when we were trying to put stuff together with those guys. And,
That does not surprise me at all.
you know,
And I think to a great extent that's the key to understanding Thad's moves at the end of his life. And
yeah.
there's a ton that could be said about that, but yes.
Mm. It's unfortunate, but it's the way it goes. It's because they never had, because the family were personal managers. If they had had another
Mhm.
manager, it may have been a different dynamic, but it was really close to home. And of course, that stuff gets discussed at home, and who knows? Anyway, that's
Yeah, I've heard similar things about Diana, Flanagan's wife, too. Um, any questions for Russ? Any comments? Any feedback besides what Pat had just said?
yeah. That was I
I
love that. I love that relationship with Pepper and Donald Byrd, and at that time, and then you know Thad's relationship in the band.
Yeah,
Russell,
It's also funny that band was Jerry Mulligan's band. So it was a baritone player that started the Thad and Mel band. Basically, it was all of Jerry Mulligan's concert jazz band that just basically they took over
Mhm.
the name and changed a couple of players and got
Yeah.
started by
Brookmeyer was in
yeah.
that band
Yep.
too. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Let's see.
Russell,
yeah, yeah.
You got it. Somebody want to say something?
Russell, who was it who said quoted someone saying Thad was Bartok with valves?
Dan
Well,
Morgenstern.
Morgenstern wrote the article quoting Mingus.
Well, actually, I think it makes sense in a way when I think about it, because speaking of altered scales, Bartok, it's all over in Bartok
Mhm.
everywhere, and of course, it's all over in Thad too. And I just I wonder, it would have been really fascinating to find out what Thad listened to. Maybe something string quartets of Bartok or uh, uh, you know music for strings, celeste, and percussion. I don't know, but that would be really interesting to find out because it's so prevalent in Thad's writing. All the
Mhm.
time. I mean, vertically as well as horizontally. Uh,
Yeah, Thad's education is an interesting topic because he was at least for as far as the trumpet playing goes was practically completely self-taught. Um, and his writing, he was in the army, so like he probably had a manual, but his ear really was his guide to a lot of things. I mean, certainly Frank Foster showed him a lot, and Frank West showed him a lot in the early years of the Basie band. Someone was saying to me that this guy Dave Dempsey who was at
William Patterson.
William Patterson had like concert band scores that he had written in the army, and I was like, I would love to see that. Just to see if there's any sign of anything that he was absorbing at that time. And that's the thing, he's not Clifford Brown. We don't have him like in his formative years. We have him as like a fully emerged professional player, all at once. So it's hard to track, where he comes from in terms of his playing or his writing. He cites Louis Armstrong. Well, everybody does. Um, but it would be great to know. Um, I mean, it's like there's hardly anything that he ever wrote that wasn't for a big band or a small group. It's like nobody ever thought let's get this guy Thad Jones to write some orchestra music for us and just see what happens. I think at the end of his life, there was a couple of Scandinavian groups that were interested, but he didn't live long enough to follow through with them. It would have been very fun to see what he really was interested in because he was already starting to write in longer forms and stretch out a little bit once he went to Europe. So there's a lot of what ifs with that.
A lot of what ifs with Pepper too. Died at 55. Had a lot of music in him still.